Welcome to Two Truth, a channel dedicated to exploring multiple perspectives on controversial topics in philosophy, religion, and history. Today's episode is certainly a controversial one. We're going to be looking at Jesus from perhaps a perspective that many of you have never heard. A lot of people in the West, especially, are familiar with the more Orthodox narrative as to who and what Jesus is and what his mission was all about. But for our first side of things today, we're going to be looking at what the Scribes and the Pharisees and even many of the Romans in the first century thought about him. So here's how it goes. There's basically a three-part plan to discredit who Jesus is, his birth, his mission as an adult, and then the death and resurrection. It's actually a phenomenally effective takedown, really. Let's not forget that if we sort of jump to the end of the story, Jesus is crucified, and there really aren't that many people there. He has very, very few followers compared to someone like a John the Baptist, say, right? Who's vastly more well-known and popular at the time in the first century. But Jesus definitely does make waves, and so the Scribes and Pharisees do want to deal with him. And let's start with point one, his birth. Here's how they go after him on this one. It's pretty simple. His mother, contrary to the Orthodox and popular opinion, they are going to claim, they being the Scribes, Pharisees, that his mother, who's very young, right, is promiscuous, far from a virgin, far from being immaculate, without the stain of original sin or something like this, that she's actually fairly well known, that she's running around with other people, including, to even name names, a soldier named Pantera, who's a Gentile, of course, a Roman, and that's pretty much the worst thing, because the Romans are the enemy, and essentially you're saying, hey, she's sleeping with the enemy and having a child with the enemy, and you shouldn't follow this guy because effectively he's from a polluted bloodline, right? That in and of itself, it's irrelevant if it's true or not, because we know today from politics and, social media that an accusation launched at someone, even if totally bogus, can still do tremendous damage, right? So similar in the first century world, that's going to be their approach. Now, what can we really say about that? Well, it is interesting that in the oldest gospel we have, Mark, Joseph isn't even mentioned. You just jump straight into sort of the adult mission of Jesus, right? In fact, you're only going to get a birth story in Matthew and Luke. That's it, right? Mark and John, you've got different things going on. Now, there is something interesting that can maybe lend support to this claim lodged by the Scribes and Pharisees. It says in Mark chapter 6, verse 3, describing Jesus as the son of Mary, not son of God or son of Joseph or anything like this. And that might seem like no big deal to 21st century ears. Read right past it, right? But you got to understand that in the first century, to describe someone as son of Mary as opposed to son of Joseph, very unusual. It's often because someone's, like, the paternity would be in question if you were to say something like that. So that's a pretty big deal. And another thing to keep in mind on any episodes where we're dealing with the Bible or Jesus is that the Gospel of Mark is the oldest. And so there isn't as much time to sort of like think through redactions and whatnot, which you will see a lot more of in Matthew, Luke, and John. In fact, that story isn't even in this whole like son of Mary's. It's not even in Matthew at all, I don't believe. And Luke and John both recast the story as son of Joseph for a reason, right? Like they recognize it's problematic and therefore change it with a simple change, right, to Joseph. So there's one thing to look at, for possible supporting evidence for this seemingly wild claim that Mary is quite the opposite of what the typical viewpoint is. Her being both a virgin and also being somehow extremely righteous or without sin, right? Could be quite the contrary to their view. Now, let's jump to adult Jesus, point 2 in this attack against him, all right? Jesus is working a bunch of miracles, especially in both John, he's working miracles, and in the Gospel of Mark, we see him doing a whole bunch of exorcisms. A lot, in fact. Now, the people that are against him and his movement, the scribes, they are very smart here. They don't say that he's not working miracles. They could try and make that case, right? Oh, this isn't, these aren't really miracles. He's a charlatan in this way, and he's like forging or staging them or using props or whatever. They're not saying something like that. They say that he is working miracles, but the question you should ask is how? By what power? This is where you're going to get this famous reference it's in many of the Gospels actually, but in Mark 3:21, I believe, where it's stated that Jesus, quote, Jesus has gone out of his mind and his family is like concerned and has to deal with him. Because remember, if you kind of lose it in the first century, that's going to affect your sisters, your parents in terms of business or, everything else, their whole reputation, right? So very fascinating line there that he's sort of gone out of his mind. And, the claim is that he has a spirit. And maybe that's what's causing all of this, right? The spirit pushes him into the wilderness. It comes right at the point of baptism. Now, that might be the Holy Spirit if we're on a more Orthodox side. But if you're against him, you can essentially say, hey, look, this guy has done the typical rituals of a magician that we are familiar with from the Greco-Egyptian magical papyri and other texts, which describe how one becomes a god and becomes a magician. And it discusses about a bird coming down, a falcon or hawk coming down and sort of like landing on the head of the magician. And so the scribes that are against him are basically saying, look, this guy's possessed. That's what it is. He has a spirit. And he doesn't just have any spirit. He has the worst. Baal-zebul, basically, right? So Baal-Hadad, or these variations from Canaanite religion and polytheism, that's like the primary rival to Yahweh, okay? So effectively they're saying this guy is possessed by the general, let's call it, of the demons, right? The worst of the worst. And that is why he is effectively casting out demons from all these other people. Because the way it works in magic is, you got the top guy, like the military. the top guy can tell every, tier underneath him or her, hey, you got to get out and do this or that. And that's what Jesus is doing. He's going up to these possessed people and he's saying, leave this guy, right? And they leave. Why? Because he's got the top, right, evil spirit in him. So pretty effective. Because again, doesn't matter if it's true or not. They're publicly making this claim against him. And it's something he and his followers, right, have to deal with and address to varying degrees, of success, I would say, right? Now, so this general kind of claim of him being like a magician, which they do believe, the people that are against him, you've got stuff like the account of the baptism, which has magical sort of elements to it. You've got him saying stuff like, Talitha cum, like little girl arise, right, or rise up, and he's sort of doing things like bringing people back from the dead and stuff that's in sort of the wheelhouse, I guess you'd say, of magicians of the day. And weirdest thing of all, the Eucharist, and if you think about it, with the Last Supper and this idea that this is my body, right? This is my blood, and the transubstantiation of bread and wine into, right, the body and the blood. That sounds extremely magical to those who aren't, faith-based believers in the religion, right? It's a pretty intense claim, and in fact, it's so intense of a claim that it's going to get them in trouble with the Romans, the early Christians, because there's confusion about, like, are they eating or drinking their God? This sounds like Dionysius or in that mystery cult, which is deemed very problematic by the Roman Empire because of its just wild, sometimes orgies or spreading of information that shouldn't be spread. So because of these central sacraments or rites that you have in Christianity, going back to Jesus, you can kind of see how both the Romans and the Jewish population are like, this is unorthodox. It's very weird. Especially the idea of drinking blood. That seems very, impure from the standpoint of the Hebrew Bible, right? So we've now dealt with a little bit for his birth, his adult mission, but to cap it off, they're like, we got to deal with this major piece, which is what really makes this a religion, Christianity in the end, rather than say, a philosopher or, I don't know, a mystic or something. This account of the death and resurrection and ascension as well. So there's an interesting way of going about discrediting this. It's typically talked about in terms of the 18th to the 20th century, actually, the Swoon Hypothesis, but it's very clear that this is, a first century situation going on, okay? So what the claim is this, right? Rather than the typical story that Jesus died on the cross, right, is taken into the tomb and, resurrected, which we'll get to that side of things here in a few minutes, right? The viewpoint here with the Swoon Hypothesis is that basically he went unconscious or passed out, and that it may have been intentionally engineered or planned this way by his followers, right? Especially Joseph of Arimathea, who had the tomb, right? Now, the way this goes is that they somehow either gave him maybe some dose. It does suggest that him getting some sort of bitter, right, bitter herb or something, right, or tonic, when he's up on the cross. But, it's a bit of a stretch, but it's possible, because if you give someone the right dosage of certain herbs, you certainly can create the effect of seemingly having like no heartbeat and unbelievably shallow breathing. And remember, it's the first century. They don't have they're not going to be able to hook you up to a bunch of machines to run further tests to see if you're actually dead or not. So you got to keep that in mind, right? So the Swoon Hypothesis, or the substitution hypothesis, that someone else takes the place of Jesus, or a third option has to do with the Greek term Docetism. So a Docetic viewpoint basically means that it seemed so that Jesus was on the cross and died, but it really was a mass hallucination event, for example, is one way you can look at that. And this viewpoint is favored in different forms of Christian Gnosticism that develops in the 1st and 2nd centuries. You'll often hear this. And interestingly, in Islam has a Docetic viewpoint of the Christology, because within Islam, it's viewed as, inconceivable that God would allow such an important prophet to be humiliated in this way, like with crucifixion and all the things that happened before the crucifixion. I believe you can see that in the Quran, Surah 4, somewhere in there, where they'll discuss this notion. So there you have it, right? A 3-part plan to basically take Jesus and his followers down, right? Attack the birth, attack the adult mission, attack the claim, the miraculous claim, right, of resurrection. It's obviously not that miraculous if someone just went unconscious or is briefly in a coma or something like this, and then is brought back while they're in the tomb, but never died, right? And then is taken out. Okay, we'll see that when we get to the Orthodox here in a minute, there are a lot of things that are addressed to try to stop the power of this claim, right? So we'll turn to that now, the Orthodox side. We'll try and match this to what we did in the first part here by looking at the birth, the adult mission statement, and the death and resurrection of Jesus. But now we'll give sort of the opposite side of what the proto-Orthodox movement is going to suggest occurred. Okay? That means we have to start by looking at Matthew and Luke in the early chapters 1 and 2, where they're going to give a genealogy for one thing, although their genealogy is not the same because they have different objectives. So in Matthew, the genealogy is going to be tied all the way back to David, King David, because you need to have that connection if you're going to make messianic claims and stuff like this. And in Matthew, you have the account of the 3 wise men, which is only there. It's not in any of the other Gospels. So many of the elements that relate to kind of your Christmas narrative that builds up is kind of like a pick and choose from various aspects of the Bible, and then many stories and things that come after. Okay? So you've got that going on, right? You've got in Matthew, you have in chapter 1, verse 19, the idea that Mary is going to conceive by the Holy Spirit, right? This is the more traditional narrative. However, it states that Joseph wants to dismiss her quietly, I believe is the exact wording. Now, you have to stop there and be like, that's interesting. He's a really kind guy for the first century. Things could go differently there. But what it sounds like is that something happened. If she's betrothed to him, maybe, right, she was with somebody else. She's quite young. He doesn't want to ruin her life and embarrass her. And so he's considering to just dismiss her quietly. But, right, angels, dreams happen, and he's going to be convinced otherwise, that this is really, Emmanuel here. This is God with us, right? This is the Incarnation, right? The divine taking on flesh, which we have to recognize that is a key point, right? The incarnation is going to be critical as a mystery of faith, because you're talking about, God, the Son, the second person of the Trinity, as these views will develop, right? Taking flesh. And that's, a critically pivotal event. And of course, Jesus is described as the Son of God, but a lot of times in the first century, whether it's in Greek sources, Roman, whatever, Son of God may as well, it can basically be understood as God. But it is confusing because, the gods like Zeus, they do have sons. And so you can make the mistake pretty easily that when they say God the Son, the second person of the Trinity, are we talking about this is actually fully God, or is it literally like God's Son who's created and comes later? So there's a lot of confusions that can develop, right, with the language that you're going to get in the New Testament, okay? And as it's translated, especially from Greek to Latin to other languages, right? Now, Luke, one of our other sources, right, for the birth, is going to have Mary state, like how will it be me that's going to have this child when I have not known a man, right, is the wording. That's in Luke chapter 1:34, okay? So here you have the statement that she is effectively a virgin, right? Because she hasn't known a man in that biblical sense, right? She hasn't been with anyone. So it's impossible. This would be called like parthenogenesis. Animals can do it. Some animals can do it, but humans, that's a no-go, right? Making this a miracle that this would occur, right? Now, we don't really have anything else that's going to help us with the birth account. You only have it in 2 of the 4 Gospels. They're not identical stories in both of those. And there's different elements that are brought up, right, in one or the other. Now, you jump from birth to 30 years old. That's a huge leap. Now, it's not uncommon telling stories at that time to do stuff like that. Even Moses, he's a baby for about 2 paragraphs or less, a paragraph, and then he's an adult. So not unusual to take this approach, but still a little bit strange when we're dealing with such an important figure as Jesus, that we have like, okay, he's a baby and now he's a 30-year-old man, right? With this intriguing mission. Luke is the only gospel writer who attempts to address this in chapter 2, verse 41, where he brings up Jesus preaching as a 12-year-old, like an adolescent, in the temple. This is not a widely agreed passage that it's like authentic, if you will, because it's only in one of the 4 Gospels, and it does seem like an attempt to just like fill in the blanks, basically. And even still, it's one story, right? I mean, it's not much. That would still be like baby 12, 30, type jump, which is why other writers will come along. And there's going to be a text called the Infancy Gospel of Thomas, not to be confused with the Gospel of Thomas, different thing, that does give a very bizarre account of Jesus as a child and doing some pretty messed up things, quite honestly. But these are not canonical, authoritative texts. There's the Infancy Gospel of Thomas, the Proto-Evangelion of James, and texts like that later on, in like, 2nd, 3rd, 4th centuries and on, will try to fill in the gaps that are left in the Gospels, right? But that's generally the key birth narrative that you're going to get is in Luke, Matthew, right? Jesus is special, Mary is special. They're singularly unique, right? And the Incarnation being critical. And they use the story of the 3 wise men to try to highlight this, by showing that, like, hey, they bring gold, they bring frankincense, they bring myrrh. Okay, gold is for kings. Jesus is the King of Kings, right? Frankincense is for high priests. He's the high priest of high priests. Myrrh is used for a variety of things, like washing the dead, if you're wealthy enough. Well, Jesus will conquer death. So it's a foreshadowing in the beginning of the story of, right, all these things that are to come for him. And it's also, this is like a little side note, a lot of people aren't aware of this. In the first century, the Emperor Nero had a guy, Tiridates, I believe, come from Parthia, like from the east, essentially like the Magi, right, coming over to Rome. And it was an extremely extravagant, expensive party that was thrown. And basically it's kind of like the emperor, kissing up to them to keep relations and vice versa and stuff like that. And so the Bible is kind of saying, like, hey, look, Jesus is just a kid. No one's paying to have people show up for him. They show up to him, not one, but three, and they bring him gifts, right? So it's just like one-upping from a famous account in the first century that people would have been familiar with. Most people have never heard of that in the 21st century. All right, that's the birth. Let's jump to the adult mission. Jesus' adult mission can be summarized in one word: metanoia. Right? Metanoia is horribly translated as repentance in a lot of these 7 out of 10 English versions of the Bible. It's not that it's 100% wrong, but the word repent is completely loaded with later Catholic, let's say, especially, right, kind of baggage, viewing us as almost fundamentally sinners. Whereas what John the Baptist, Jesus, and Paul are really suggesting when it comes to the term metanoia, and they're all going to use it, is that they're calling sinners, which only means, like in Greek, people who have missed the mark, right? You're just not living an ideal, virtuous life. They're calling those people to totally transform their heart and their mind. Conversion. That's really what metanoia is all about. If you want to break the word apart, it is interesting. It's kind of like means beyond or after, perception or the intellect. So there's this notion that it's kind of telling us we need to rely on a specific type of faith, very, very intense form of faith to transform our soul. That's what's going to be necessary to like affect this total transformation, to let the head descend and, connect to the heart space. So that's, roughly what John the Baptist, Jesus, and Paul are all claiming that they're trying to do with their mission, which is pretty straightforward, pretty simple sounding, right, on the surface of it. Another thing to look at when it comes to Jesus' mission is to address the Sermon on the Mount. So the Sermon on the Mount is found in Matthew chapters 5-8, and very, very famous, where you have this lengthy account of Jesus preaching, mainly looking at like the 10 Commandments and kind of rephrasing them, and in many ways making them even more intense. But we have to ask ourselves, like, what is Jesus's like procedure or method? And it's another reason why the Scribes and the Pharisees are going to be so pissed off, to put it bluntly. He's going to show up in public places, which you have to do because you need your honor rating to go up or down in the ancient world, like your credit score would now, right? You want your honor rating to go up. The only way for it to go up is a public challenge, right? That's why it's always Jesus out there with his friends versus all these other people and people watching, sort of thing, right? So Jesus's method is very confusing. It would be disarming for people in the first century. Typically, you expect you're going to show up and it's going to be like a public debate where we're both using scripture maybe and just quoting it in a a somewhat similar way. Maybe we're from somewhat different schools of thought on interpreting that scripture, but Jesus is coming like way out of left field with stuff, and he loves to paradoxically flip a lot of things, right? So, for example, right, the idea that you should effectively love your enemies, pray for those who persecute you. Well, that's the opposite, right? Of what you should do. You should hate your enemies and seek their destruction. That's what everyone would expect in the first century for you to say. For you to suggest otherwise, that you should love your enemies, sounds like you're folding, right? And that you're weak and a coward. All of those are vices, right? That's not virtue. In fact, they're going to be viewed as very female traits at the time. So that's basically what Jesus is doing, this like unorthodox, paradoxical approach. The question is why? What does it achieve? And I think the simple answer here is that if you come to a debate with that approach, what's going to happen is in the process of the debate, when you say something weird like that, there's not going to be an answer right away, right? Almost all of us were reactive, right? We've got our preloaded, talking points. If it's a political debate. So if they're going to say that, oh, they said it, I'm going to launch this thing that I already knew I was going to say. And so Jesus is well aware of that. He comes into these debates saying something so bizarre that it short circuits you. When you think about it, right? Like you can't, if you're like a scribe, Pharisee, these groups arguing against them, you can't just have this instant, reaction because you've never heard it before. So you actually have to stop, pause, create a space, reflect, and even that doesn't look good, right? Because in a debate where it's like 30-second gap or something like that, it almost feels like the other side got you, regardless of whatever you just say finally when something comes to you, right? So smart that what he's doing has that effect. But also I think the point is it creates a clearing or a space for a wholly new way of being and living and seeing things, right? And the power of paradox to sort of deconstruct and undo a lot of the social conditioning. So that's perhaps, one take on what Jesus' adult mission is achieving, right? Now, let's jump to the last point. Jesus, his death, crucifixion, death, resurrection, right? So, the standard account, he's arrested, he's put on trial, you've got Pontius Pilate, and the Jewish population's angry, right, about it, this Sanhedrin, and they're all kind of dealing with it and against him, and it's essentially, they're like, hey, he's done. So, we're going to crucify him, right? And he's crucified, he dies relatively fast, and his body is given to Joseph of Arimathea and is put in the tomb, and then this tomb is sealed, and then miraculously later, right, he is not there, he's been resurrected. And the proof for some of the resurrection can be found on the burial cloth, better known today for those who believe it as the Shroud of Turin, one of the most important relics in Christendom, that has this fascinating, if you took a negative of a photograph, kind of that negative impression on the cloth with blood stains and whatnot and all the right spots. And the belief is that for some that image is from the moment of resurrection, where it essentially just like emblazoned this image onto the cloth, right? Making it an extremely important artifact and relic. Right? Now, I got to point out though, because remember the Swoon Hypothesis was used against him. So in Matthew 28:64, it's going to be stated that guards are placed at the tomb by the Romans. Now, it doesn't say that in the other gospel accounts. Why bring it up? because people are suggesting in the first century that, hey, this guy had his friends more or less take him down when he wasn't dead yet, put him in a tomb, have him come out days later, boom, resurrection, their movement's going to blow up, right, from this. So there's an attempt in Matthew to address this and say, hey, look, it's not possible that Jesus's friends did this, smuggled him out of the tomb. There's guards there, right? Now, whether or not that's true, we'll never know, but it's interesting because it's not in the other really, accounts of it. So, be that as it may, right? He comes back though, right? Resurrection, comes back. He sees many of his followers, and then he ascends to be at the right hand of the Father, right? So that's the standard account. You need to believe as a Christian in the Incarnation. You need to believe in the death and resurrection, the ascension, and many of these important mysteries of faith. One last thing to address here that we'll end on has to do with the concept of the Antichrist. Okay? So this idea normally today is weirdly blown out of proportion. People talk about it as if it's a political figure who will start some new world order and all of this, madness, really. It's key to look at the first century, as always, and see what that's all about. Now, some of the later texts in the New Testament, 1st, 2nd John, these very short letters, are going to have to deal with something called Gnosticism that I brought up earlier. We'll have episodes on that later, right? So be sure to check those out when they come out. But for now, it's key that we look at the idea that Jesus wasn't really a flesh and blood person, because some of these Gnostics are going to suggest this. It's back to this term I mentioned earlier called Docetic or Docetism, this to seem so. That's what it means in Greek. So it only seems so, seems like that he's here as a flesh and blood person, but he's really a spiritual being. If you believe that, you are by definition to the New Testament an Antichrist. Plural, there's not one. It makes it very clear that there's many, because it's anyone who's going to sort of take some of these Gnostic ideas, all right? So that's another standpoint when it comes to his birth, life, death, and resurrection that has to be addressed later on in the New Testament. So there you have it. There are a lot of things to probably digest in this episode. As always, I encourage comments, and I'm only giving you 2 truths. There are many other angles, right, to this, and that's what the comments are for, and I'm happy to reply to any of you in those comments. Now, given that there's always multiple issues to any of these topics, the way I look at it is you should always do your best to see both sides, but stay gray.